Our Futures 202, Lecture 7, and we're looking at the Futures sense of voice. So that's the third Futures sense, and it grows out of or emerges from the tensions between the Futures sense of memory and the Futures sense of foresight. It's basically how do we, you and I, activate our foresight, our anticipatory capacity, abilities? How do we direct them? And so on. And this, of course, is about a feeling for the future. So, and following on from the last lecture where we were looking at the feeling around foresight, looking at visualizations and the work of, people like Oliver Markley and so on. I want to again touch on some of the great thinkers in the early stages of future studies as a discipline. This time looking at the work of Fred Pollack and Robert Jung and so on, and then moving into the contemporary condition, looking at the work of Rob Hopkins and so on, because he's a great futures feeler. He's very strong on the imagination, as you would know, because I used his work in the last lecture. So yeah, let's start off though by looking at futures at scale, because this is a really important dimension to me. This thinking across scales, the local, the micro, me. How am I, this little me? How am I linked somehow to planetary futures? Doesn't seem to make sense at some level, and yet at another level, intuitively, I feel somehow that is right. That I am not a simply, a cut off, a isolated unit in this planetary adventure that we're on. I'm actually part of a species which is part of an ecology and environment of multi-species futures. Okay, and this is all really important. And voice, how do we actually enact this work, is key. So let me leap into the PowerPoint, which I've got up nicely for you with that funny picture of the guy going, huh? So a voice, of course, is, well, how the hell do I actually activate my voice? And this is, a very important question. And really, it's about what I think all of us, all the time, are wrestling with, that somehow we can feel so small and so isolated. And of course, that plays to big power games, where we can think, well, what can I do about Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, and Russia, American politics, the movement to the right across the planet, people's fears? What do we do with not just people's fears, my fears? Okay, so this is important. And I want to start off with a very simple point, which is being made by Rebecca Solnit some decades ago, where she did this wonderful book called Wanderlust, and it's the history of walking. And I really, early on in the book, I was really struck by this statement where she says, when you give yourself to places, they give you yourself back. The more one comes to know them, the more one seeds them with the invisible crop of memories and associations that will be waiting for you when you come back, while new places offer up new thoughts, new possibilities, past memories and new thoughts. Exploring the world is one of the best ways of exploring the mind, and walking travels both terrains, the mind and the world, the inner and the outer. So many different ways that this interesting relationship between our subjectivities and the empirical real, that hard world where if you drop a brick on your foot it hurts, that sort of thing, that we are always, I think, as human beings engaged in that space. And as futurists, emergent futurists, wannabe futurists, if you want to use that term, thinking about going out and making a living as a consultant, or maybe going into universities like I am and working with students and so on, there is this tension, and it's a lived tension, and it's not just me and you working out how each of us individually can deal with it, we as facilitators need to be able to help others handle it, right? So that's where voice comes in. So in paper that I wrote, or a chapter that I wrote for a book, the chapter will be available in the readings and so on. You know, I make this point. Voice balances the fact that history frames subjectivity and populates the subject's interior with images not her own. The senses of memory and foresight, therefore, come to the aid of voice in supporting the struggle to be a little more free from the burden of conditioning. Voice is the counterpoint to the collective experience. That's key, you know, it really is. A voice counters the sense of just being a part of a sea of, 8+ billion voices on the planet at the moment. And that's just the human voices, not, you know, the birds and the trees and the grass and the microbes, the mycelia and atoms and everything else that's actually making a lot of sound, if you can listen to it. And there I'm thinking of Buddhism and its the vibrating heart of this universe, which is alive to us, and we are potentially alive to it. So that situates us in a sense. So what can we say? Well, then we can turn to two wonderful scholars. Veena Das, who 30 years ago now wrote a great paper on voice and culture, and she makes this point, you know, that the appearance of voice as a standing beside culture must, much as it means stands beside a word. Okay, so what did she mean here? So her position on voice culture, arguing that the appearance of voice as standing beside culture, much as meaning stands beside a word. Meaning and word, car, dog, they have meanings. And we have a kind of visual, visceral sense of car and dog. Voice stands beside culture in a similar way. Culture is voiced. It is done by you and me. And that is, you know, a really significant insight into the relationship between you, the small you, the little you, in wherever you're living, and the greater us, which is the world that we inhabit, the world of culture. And of course, culture is not simply the human edifice of culture that we might think of. It's also culture as nature. Nature and culture are not to be separated in a foresight world where we're thinking of the future. Now, Bronowski, writing decades before, 4 decades, as I say there, before Veena Das, in 1954, he makes the following point, that man, he's writing the 50s, so man and society are members, each of the other. Just like voice and culture go together, man and society go together, such as the physical world exists in each atom and in the whole stellar system together. So we have atoms, the physical world exists in each atom. He's saying that the micro and the macro collapse or fold together. Does this all sound familiar? Because basically I've been saying this in one way or another for the last 6 lectures we're at now. Okay, so this is lecture 7. So yeah, this is a dominant theme, that you cannot separate the individual and the micro from the macro. All right? So what is it? We're moving from what is to what if. That's the title of Robert Hopkins' book, okay? But long before he wrote his book, before he was possibly even born, I don't know, he would have been, he's probably about my age, so he's around, but not very much around. Fred Pollack was writing this fabulous book on images of the future, and he makes the following point. Man is only able to conceive of the existence of the other, the something which is basically different from the here and now. So that's his definition of the other. The something which is basically different from the here and now, because his mental structure has a dividing property built into it. The dividing property works, 1, on the self, creating a divided self, the inner and the outer, and 2, on perceptions, feelings and responses. That's the feelings of the future, right? Responses. So that everything which is not self is divided into existing reality. That's me whacking the table, right? And the other, that possible alternative reality, is the capacity for mental division to understand what is and what might be, or what if, okay, that enables man, that's all of us, to be a citizen of two worlds. And remember, I talk about being a cultural citizen, a citizen of two worlds, this world and an imagined world. I think that's an incredibly awesome way to express this insight. So he's saying that there is a divided self, that we have a world that's interior, a world of yearnings and feelings and longings and imaginings. I can imagine myself being X, or I can imagine a world in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time where no longer do we have, this kind of binary between the right and the left, and strange politics like that, okay? So we can imagine those things. So there's that. This is the other. And as I'll say it once more, that little bit from this quote where he says, the something which is basically different from the here and now. And that's what futurists are into, and it's what voice is all about. It's about actually achieving the realization of some of those inner dimensions in the external world. So Pollack continues on the same page by saying, man builds himself another realm to stand over and against and contrast with the realm in which he has his corporeal existence. Do I do it again? There you go, the corporeal, the physical, okay? So there's a physical existence, but there's a psycho-emotional, soulful, spiritual world, whatever you want to call it, imaginary world. Out of this antithesis between the imagined and the real, the realm of the future is born. I just love that. The logic is so clear. So there is this tension between the imagined and the real. And it's that tension, as we work it, that enables us to generate alternative futures. And it's always been at work. He's a sociologist by training, Pollack was, and he had a deep sense of history, and he could chart this through different times. Let's say the French Revolution. There were people in, the 1780s in France suffering under, a delusional king who didn't actually have any sense at all what was really happening politically, consciously around him in the world of pre-revolutionary France. And then suddenly this burst of energy occurs, and you have the French Revolution, they pull down the monarchy and so on. And this new future for France, but also for Europe, because of course the French Revolution leads to Napoleon, and that leads to the, in a sense, the forcing of the Enlightenment down the throats of millions of people across the European continental area and so on. So we have all this happening, and you can do that with any number of points in history. But we're not going to do that. But we're going to look at this. The realm of the future is born. And I want to jump to, this might surprise some of you, Sharon Blackie, who's written this fabulous book called Haggitude. And it's written for women, but I think it really is relevant for us all. So she says, the late author, Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my all-time heroes, expresses this idea beautifully about being born. The woman who is willing to make this change, okay, between, in the limited context or the narrow context, is the change between being a fertile woman to a post-fertile woman where you can no longer have children. But I'm thinking more culturally, so I'll start that again. The woman who is willing to make that change must become pregnant with herself at last. To be pregnant with ourselves. What an incredible image that is, because we are pregnant, all of us, with the future. She must bear herself, her third self, because of course there's the prepubescent woman, then there's the fertile woman, and then there's the woman menopausal. That's what she's talking about in this sense, into her old age. She concludes, I love this idea because to me transformation is everything. It's the purpose of life, and it's where voice sits, You and I, each one of us, is constantly reworking ourselves, re-exploring our narratives. We don't just have one single memory. We have multiple memories of the same thing, and different days, different emotional states that we're in. We were remembering something with a positive light or a negative light. We will be changing the story, not necessarily because we want to create a tissue of lies, but because we see things differently, because our subjectivities are fluid. And that's very much part of what Sharon Blackie's book is all about. Hackitude, great book. So we've got to live the questions, and this is where Daniel Christian Wahl comes in. He does a lot of beautiful work, particularly on regenerative ecology and economics and social stuff. Okay, and he's talking here. So he's giving us a contextual picture. Our voice is amplified when we find our tribe, when we sit with others and we share our enthusiasms. As you know, this course is in a sense about that. So what does he have to say? Well, he goes like this. Social innovation, peer-to-peer collaboration, open knowledge and technology, the spread of maker culture, additive manufacturing, circular economy initiatives, and diverse community networks are powerful enablers and catalysts in the creation of collaborative and regenerative system structures that nurture regenerative cultures. People, that's you and I, are already living these questions together and transforming the world one place at a time. Another world is possible, he concludes. It's a beautiful statement, but it links this, you and I living the question, with collective work. Culture, society, they are collective processes. We add to those processes each time we get a new idea or just decide to do something different. It's even about deciding to take the bus to work or the train to work instead of the car. These small decisions. What am I going to eat for dinner tonight? Will I eat tofu or will I eat beef? Oh, tofu has its own ecological footprint. We have to become conscious about everything, right? And of course, it's all about balancing, trying to balance things out and just trying to do it a little bit better than the last time, right? So we need to imagining the different. We need to do something else. So back to Fred Pollack. So on the same page as that other quote, he follows it up with this. A primary source of historical process lies in man's capacity to imagine the non-existent, the other, as different, even as contrary to that which exists. To imagine the unknown and inconceivable as a beyond or hereafter. This mental leap carries man over the boundaries of the existent into the other world of the unreal, the irrational, the imaginary, the supernatural, and the unending. Every man who takes thought about the past and the future is to some sort of contact with the other realm. So there's a lot happening in that one. First of all, maybe you're thinking, that reminds me of Jim Data's stuff on, and his 13th principle about the future is that everything should be, the second one, principle that is, that any suggestion about the future should seem to be ridiculous. Okay, so there is that. There is a sense of irrationality. How can the world be different from what it is? Can we imagine a world where people actually sit down and work out their problems rather than going to war? Can we imagine a world where the super rich actually go, oh, gosh, what have we been doing all our lives? Amassing this huge amount of wealth so that while the majority of humanity is still struggling on a day-to-day basis, let's redistribute it. I mean, that sounds totally ridiculous. But if we're imagining it, we're starting to put flesh on the bones, you might say. So every man, he concludes, takes thought about past and the future is in some sort of contact with this other realm. That, in other words, there's an alternative universe, you might say, that we are part of. One of Pollack's colleagues was Robert Jung. And Robert Jung, writing pretty much in the same sort of time frames as Pollack, and they had worked together at different times. Robert Jung makes this point, and it's a point about the drive to control that systems have and our need to push back. I thought it was a useful counterpoint, okay, to the kind of suggestion that Pollack's making. In the 20th century, Jung goes on, new mental powers have been developed by education and information. Majority of humanity is literate, for instance. But we have not understood how to absorb and use them any better than we did earlier discoveries of material and physical possibilities. The reaction to this crisis follows a predictable pattern. And think about our education systems today and many other forms. There is a demand either for running down and curtailing so-called excessive educational provisions, or for more control over training. Yeah, I live this daily almost at the university. Instead of opportunities to develop, people are to be offered precisely defined roles. You're going to be a nurse, a doctor, or whatever, within carefully programmed organisations without any say in their design, construction, or control. So we offer a degree in X or Y at the university. You have to conform to achieve the outcomes of that degree. And if you don't, well, you don't end up being able to be a dentist or a lawyer or whatever else. So this is something that we need to understand, is that there are very strong powers, conditioning powers that are societal. But of course, we make society, so our voice, if we start to raise our voice, if we start to explore alternatives, undermines the process that Jung is describing here. So, what's the hardest thing? Well, freeing ourselves from a given reality to really set our minds and hearts free, to make different choices, go in different directions, especially when we might have children to worry about how are they going to survive, what's the future going to be like for them. Yeah, am I making the right decision for them by taking them out of school and homeschooling or sending them to some other kind of school? These are things that are legitimately concerning parents. I get it. Or if you're a younger person, am I taking the right course? Am I going to, if I can become a lawyer, maybe I can change the world. It reminds me of Kate Raworth, who wrote the book on donut economics, where she describes her own training as an economist was really distasteful to her. She felt, and like many, that she has to go through it in order to come outside the other end. But, many people go in and they just basically end up becoming what they might struggle against. So that's a really important thing. So what does it do? Well, it takes energy, emotional energy particularly. What is very key for voice, and drawing particularly on the foresight lectures that are in the sense of foresight, the future sense, imagination is key. We need to reopen the cultural toolbox that we've inherited. Okay, we need to become cultural citizens and deploy our creative traditionalism. The cultural citizen is someone who recognizes that they are part of a culture, not a nation state, and that therefore our choices as cultural citizens can be informed by the kind of culture we would wish for the future, a culture of peace as opposed to a culture of violence, a culture of equitable distribution of economic assets as opposed to a culture of accumulation and so on. And we are reminded by people like, Roman Krishnarik, in his book on the Good Ancestor and his other book on history, that things have been different. Graeber and Wengrow in their book as well, The Dawn of Everything, remind us that there is so much diversity and so much difference in the past that this mono-present that we live in is actually an illusion. You might want to say it's a lie. Certainly it's a very narrow and anorexic culture. So we can turn to our eyes creatively, imaginatively to our traditions and revive them, find other elements of our pasts. This is the future sense of memory, really taking on a dynamic role in framing how we might express our voices. Okay, so we need to lighten up. That means not take it too seriously. I mean, we've got to have some fun, because the emotional energy that it takes to resist, if you're just resisting, you end up like, I'll go back to the French Revolution example, where once you got rid of a despot, you bring in another one, okay? Because you actually didn't have an alternative in mind. You just wanted to resist. And final point, we need a tribe. We need to belong somewhere. So I'm going to shift gear now and look at Rob Hopkins' work. He's got this lovely brand new book out, 2025, Falling in Love with the Future. And he says on page 1, there are, of course, an infinite number of possible futures that lie ahead of us. Quantum threads, I love that, quantum threads stretching out into the distance. Now, I think I know what I'll do. I'm going to go straight to the next slide, which is the very first lines of the chapter, actually, the introduction. It's still on page 1. He says, look, travelling through time was disorienting the first few times that I did it. But I feel I have got the hang of it now. Just as sailors get their sea legs, I've got my time legs. And I love that. And what he does, at the first few pages of that book, actually, he's talking about time travel. And it's because it's in 2020 when COVID hit, he set up a podcast in which he time traveled with 2 invited guests every time he ran the podcast, which I think was almost weekly for a period of time. It was an amazing effort. He would take people on a time travel visualization thing, a bit like the kind of work that Oliver Markley and others do. And hopefully you'll get around to playing with this because it's a lot of fun. So there's this time traveling thing that he does, and so he walks us through the time traveling. He goes into the future, only a decade or something, or it's now half a decade. Don't know when he was writing this introduction, but he goes into 2030, and already the world is very different. The air is cleaner. There's a whole bunch of other things, and he describes them all. And he describes them through the senses. There's feeling, the smell, the air is different. The sound is different, much more bird song in this inner city suburb wherever he's at, type thing. So he actually anchors this process, this visualizing time traveling process, in key indicators for the sensory, so that he's creating an image of the future that he's anchoring in physical senses in this case. Okay, so it's a really interesting process that he's on about, and he got a bunch of rules, not a bunch, it's only 5 of them actually, on how to time travel. The rules for time traveling, he says, and this was on page 3, where he says, you're not allowed to bring any books back from the future. Okay, that's cheating, he says. Okay, people in the present, that's you and me now, have to figure that out. How do we get to that delightful future that he envisions? We've got to avoid the silly stuff, the kind of Back to the Future movie stuff. You're not allowed to fall in love with your mum or kill your grandparents, as he says, that sort of stuff. There's no past planning, which is a form of complaint. As sociologist Ruha Benjamin puts it, we need to give the voice of the cynical, skeptical grouch that patrols the borders of our imagination a rest. We need to put the cynic, the doubter, aside and say, no, it's actually possible that we could end up with a world where people will be looking back in the very near future, 5-10 years from now, and saying, what on earth were we doing 10 years ago, 5 years ago, with a Trump, with Netanyahu doing this? What were our institutions doing? That kind of stuff, where we actually can believe that there are strong alternatives. And he says, make sure your batteries are fully charged. And that's emotional batteries, as well as, he's having a bit of fun here and saying your recording devices to run out of charge. You don't want your iPhone or whatever it is to go flat, right? And then he says, and never time travel for personal gain. Intention and motivation are all important. I think that's very important. Travel for curiosity and for the well-being of others. So there is a sense then that you're time traveling into the future in order to explore rich alternatives. Of course, that means scenarios, imagination, following things like the futures circles, where you follow the, God, I've gone and lost the name for it. The implications one, where you go through it, first order implications, second order implications, third order implications, and so on, where you've got all sorts of tools. You can also backcast, because you can travel back in time. That's why he talks about you can't go back and kill your grandparents, right? and that sort of stuff. So you're avoiding the silly stuff. So there's a backwards and forwards to this time traveling stuff, because if you go backwards and imagine an alternative to let's say the dominance of petrochemicals on the planet, which sort of between 1910 and 1920, the battle was over. Water or hydrogen had lost, petrochemicals had won. And there are lots of, powerful reasons why that turned out that way, and powerful in the sense that power was playing out, right? And then how do you find your tribe? Well, I have a lot of fun. I follow these guys, the tennis ambassadors, which are that's Swedish for species ambassadors. These are a group of people that are working across Scandinavia, in Sweden, in Denmark, Norway particularly, and they organise displays like this, conferences and so on, and they organise local events, 1 or 2 cities, Borås or wherever it might be. And these are simple clips straight off my LinkedIn. Is it LinkedIn? Or no, this one's from Facebook. These ones are from Facebook. And just to show that you can build a tribe and have a lot of fun. Look at the joy on these people's faces. They've got great signs. They're all dressed up. As species ambassadors, it's not just being a human ambassador for the future or the present, but you can go and find a spider or a bird or a tree and talk to it, and that species person will talk back to you. Okay, so this requires us getting what good old Rob Hopkins calls a taste for the future. So this species ambassador stuff that we're looking at here is about speaking on behalf of future generations, and also Who Speaks for Wolf, which I referred to before. Who Speaks for Wolf is that wonderful and Native American story about whenever we make a decision about the future, that decision needs to be represented by or spoken to by non-human beings who will obviously be affected by that. So somebody or some people in every community would speak on behalf of the non-human or the more than human, however you like to put it. We've also got to follow our heart. So part of the voicing, of course, is to align our internal aspirations with what we do. Okay, some of that is what is called future design or future design. That's what Rob Hopkins calls it at the end of his book, From What Is to What If, which is the 2019 book, and I quote, "The idea is simple, that in every act of decision making that has implications for the future, some people participate who represent future generations and who speak for their perspective." Okay, and I'm stretching that by introducing Who Speaks for Wolf to not just future generations of human beings, but of the more than human as well. Okay, so that's the way voice is playing out here. Now I want to turn back a little bit to my original work here as well. It's about folded temporalities, and I'll make it very clear. So I'm going to read this quite slowly for you. In the expression of voice, we find ourselves mirrored in our actions. We need to align what we do with what we say. It is the doing that counts, because doing builds culture, right? Doing anchors us in time, whilst not denying access to other times simultaneously. That's why this slide's titled Folded Temporalities. Other times simultaneously are working at the same time. For example, an ISIS type suicide bomber. They exist in modern time, but also in mythic time, because they are dealing with a mythic apprehension of the world that's run through an ideology. Okay, they may also carry other temporalities as well, such as the memory of a sibling who years earlier died in an act of defiance or savagery. So there's a biographic. Thus, biographic time meets mythic time and informs action in chronologically present time. Say all these times. That's why I italicize them here. They exist simultaneously, creating the delicious temporal paradoxes that bring human psychological and spiritual richness and pain, thinking about the ISIS suicide bomber, to life. Next slide, I think, is damaged. Yes, pull that. Oops. Look at that. What did I do? I forgot to format the slide. Bear with me a moment, everybody. Bing, jump down here, jump over here, pull that down. I said pull it down. Come on, stay there. So, I continue. Approaching this sense involves providing people with reflective tools, like the visioning process we were talking about, time travel, whatever, that enable them to escape their own conditioning. This, in turn, opens up the possibility of aligning their actions and aspirations with broader stories. So there's an alignment issue here. As a sense, this is an embodied activity that must be situated in the doing as action builds culture, right? So new cultures emerge from new actions that are reflective of new choices, new values, and new imaginative configurations, all pragmatically anchored in the real problems of the life world. So in our last workshop, we talked about pragmatism quite a bit, and we ended up touching on apocalyptic thinking and the way it, absolves us of responsibility, because with the apocalypse, of course, if you're a good guy, you're going to go to heaven, and if you're not, you'll get what you deserve, okay? So our actions build culture, and that's something that's really important. And I had this, I'll pull it back up here now, this great photograph of these legs walking, because I started this lecture off by referring to Rebecca Solnit's History of Walking, Wanderlust, and it's about walking the day-to-day life. It's about being present, showing up, and doing our bit, one might say. So, heading towards the end of the lecture here. So how do we resource this? Well, obviously we've got a bunch of tools at our fingertips, but let's look. Tools that enhance the imagination whilst providing actionable strategies in the present. So we need that. We need to identify tools. You will, each one of you, as you develop your future's foresight capacity, will find your favorite tools. For many, it might be CLA. For others, it might be the 3 horizons. For others, it might be scenario planning or the visioning processes of Oliver Markley, or you develop your own, inspired by Markley, of course, and so on. So whatever these tools are, they need to be not just sort of fantasy tools or whatever, they need to actually bear fruit in action. Remember that the future is a principle of present action. We can time travel, we can imagine or vision, we can develop scenarios and speculative fiction, storytelling and that sort of stuff. We can play and obviously also develop ritual, all assisted and supported by the Futures Toolbox that we've touched on in Futures 101. So in conclusion then, for me, human beings, we're storytellers, right? We see a pattern in the stars and in the subatomic domain, and we try to figure out their meanings. We are shadowed by huge intolerances and intellectual limitations. We don't know what we don't know, do we? Yet we are also gifted with the capacity to upend the apple cart and rearrange our world's meaning structures. That's what it's all about, and voice is where it starts. It's you and me. We need to take the future personally and to find ways in which we can upset the apple carts that we've inherited, right? So with that, I'll jump back to this for a moment and I'll say thank you very much. I hope this has provided some sort of basis or foundation for understanding this future sense of voice, because we need to understand that it's you and I releasing the potential of our own ability to make differences in our own life worlds that mean that new futures cumulatively emerge, especially when we're with our tribes, okay? And the tribe might be a very small tribe, or it might be planetary. You might be, a thought leader on YouTube or TikTok or wherever it is, or you might be quietly on a hill like I am, having a natter with a few of my dear friends. Thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon.